I want to start, obviously, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country upon which we work here at QUT, the Turrbal and Yagara people as the First Nations owners of the lands where QUT now stands. Pay my respects to their elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits, and recognize that these unceded lands have always been places of teaching, research, and learning. I'd like to acknowledge, and QUT acknowledges, the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within the QUT community. And I'm sure the same goes for you folks in Canberra and the First Nations peoples there as well. And really wherever you're joining us from, of course, around the country. Apologies to those of you in the room who may have heard me present something along these lines before, but you'll at least have some new images to look at as well as I go, because I've been busy on Midjourney again. But obviously, I'm talking about polarization, and this is the sort of thing that comes up in Midjourney when you ask it for an image on polarization, which is just great because it gives us so many of the preconceived notions about polarization as well. It's red versus blue, of course, which is a very American, but maybe also Australian thing to an extent. It's two white males, and it's all very ossified, set in stone, and fixed, and obviously quite conflictual as well. But I think it's just a great image to start on. And I really want to talk about polarization in a broader sense than just this stale white males competing with each other for votes. But let's use that as a starting point, I suppose. Obviously, when we talk about polarization, there's plenty of examples out there now. This is now 2 years old, but probably hasn't changed all that much from the US, for instance, where we still have a very deep division on who is the true president of the United States. And of course, this sort of stuff leads to that sort of stuff, and more locally leads to these sorts of things as well. So we have lots of evidence of what we might call polarization, of course, in politics, in public perceptions, in particularly aftermath also of COVID-19, of course. So that's really what prompted, I guess, me, and what prompted a lot of the work that we're doing now as well. There's a lot of talk about polarization, a lot of various forms of evidence of polarization out there as well. But at the same time, the concept itself and what it might mean is also quite poorly understood, unfortunately. So that's really what we're trying to do, what we're trying to address also with this laureate project. And of course, we're also seeing these sorts of things. I wanted to show this just briefly because I'll have a bit more to say about particularly this sign there with all the Australian flags that you see on the right there, a bit further down the track. But this is also a sign of extreme, well, maybe polarization, maybe hyperpartisanship, in fact, and those two might not be the same thing. But that's also something I want to say a little bit more about as we go from here as well. So just laying out a few of the sort of the extreme examples of polarization, of course, and of hyperpartisanship that we do encounter, and we have encountered en masse over the last few years, particularly also during the COVID days. Again, this is what Midjourney gives you when you ask it for hyperpartisanship. And I think I kind of like this image as well because it shows the sort of the weirdness of polarization perhaps as well, and the aggression, I guess, that's in there as well. I have no idea what cartoonist it's ripped off here, but probably someone might recognize the style. So I want to talk about both polarization and hyperpartisanship in this talk, basically, and maybe see if we can start to distinguish those a bit more as we go as well. Now, if this is sort of the state of public debates in certain places on certain topics, where does all of this come from? The easy answer that's been proposed a few times, even by a former US president in his farewell speech, is that it's filter bubbles, it's social media, it's all of these sorts of things. It's the technologies as well. I mean, as you see here, Obama's saying for many of us, it becomes safer to retreat into our own bubbles, in our neighborhoods, our college campuses, our places of worship, or especially our social media feeds, surrounded by people who look like us and share the same political outlook and never challenge our assumptions. In some ways, that for me was also a starting point for this whole project, because We see these claims, we see them often go unchallenged as well, unquestioned. And I think that's problematic because if you look at the evidence, it's actually very scant that such a thing as filter bubbles or echo chambers, which is the flip side of this, actually do exist. I've done quite a bit of work over the last few years, as many of you know, on this, and really there is just very, very limited evidence that any of this exists in the first place. So, and this is Eli Pereza, who you might recognize as the person who really popularized the idea of the filter bubble. It's quite convenient, obviously, to just be able to blame the algorithms, to blame the platforms, to blame the underlying assumptions that some tech bro perhaps incorporated into those platforms. But unfortunately, again, there just isn't that much evidence that these things actually do exist. We've done some work with the Center of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making in Society. There's been plenty of other work in this sort of same vein as well, looking, for instance, at search recommendations to see if, in fact, recommendations for certain searches are highly personalized, and if that might then also provide the basis for polarization, for pushing people into different filter bubbles. That's really the original idea of filter bubbles. And the result really is that there isn't. This is a graph for searches for Black Lives Matter, and the results that we're seeing for that across a very broad range of participants. And the same results are always at the top, basically, with very little variation. So if you're searching for Black Lives Matter, whether you're right-wing, left-wing, young, old, higher education, low education, whatever it might be, you essentially get the same top results. There's a lot more fluctuation further down, and that's perhaps more driven by the day-to-day sort of news content and activities around Black Lives Matter. But overall, whatever you're searching for, if you're searching for Black Lives Matter, basically, whoever you are, you'll see the same thing. So this is evidence, and this is only one small piece of evidence, but there's been plenty of studies now using a number of different methodologies. This is evidence that there isn't such a thing as filter bubbles in search, basically. People see the same results. One study that did this, in fact, even said, well, it'd be nice if there was more variation, because essentially you're getting recommended the same top 4 or 5 news outlets for every topic that you're searching for. And that's also not good for society. If you're just seeing the same top outlets over and over again, you don't actually get enough diversity in your recommendations. So filter bubbles from that perspective are dead, I think. And this is, again, work that we did some years ago, mapping the Australian Twitter sphere. Echo chambers are also, there's also no evidence there, because what we're seeing in this, and we've looked at the clusters that exist in the follower networks of the Australian Twitter sphere, what we're seeing essentially is that people are very thoroughly interconnected with each other across all sorts of interests and boundaries, political and other interests. We're seeing there that the progressive and hard right clusters that you sort of see in the top left there, for instance, are actually quite close together and are well connected to each other as well. The only cluster that stands out a little bit from all of this is the porn cluster, and that's for obvious reasons. Perhaps people don't publicly follow porn accounts, they just follow each other. So there might genuinely be a porn echo chamber, but that's not really what Cass Sunstein tends to write about when he writes about echo chambers. So again, a lot of the work that has been done simply doesn't show any evidence of echo chambers in social media networks. So if it's not that, then what? And, again, I could go into more detail, and I've written a book about it, so you're very welcome to have a look at that, of course. I agree with this article from Vice in Germany that says the filter bubble is the dumbest metaphor on the internet. Look, it has a lot of competition because there's lots of pretty dumb metaphors out there, but it's certainly up there in the top 5, I would say. So if it's not filter bubbles, if it's not echo chambers, well, what is driving polarization if in fact there is a drive towards polarization these days? And my answer is actually it's the very opposite of the disconnection, or of the disconnection that echo chambers and filter bubbles imply. It's hyperconnectivity. It's the fact that we are all bombarded with information. We all have easy access to information on whatever topic we might be looking for. And it's what people do with that information, how they process that information, that actually is much more likely to lead to polarization, to hyperpartisanship. And that's where I actually get back to this image as well. And I'll just leave it up there for a moment for you to study it in all its beauty. If you see all of the different things that are on there, I'm not going to want to read them out, all of them, but you see QAnon there, you see, of course, the Pizzagate stuff and all sorts of stuff. This is not someone who's disconnected in some form. This is not someone who's in an echo chamber, in a filter bubble. This is someone who is hyper-connected, who's getting their information from all over the place and is trying to somehow construct some kind of coherent worldview from all of that, probably with some help from QAnon and other kind of disinformation influences. So what's happening here is hyperconnectivity and hyperpartisanship. People actually having conducting motivated searches for certain kinds of content and incorporating that into their worldview, and possibly also having some difficulty. I'm not making a judgment on this particular lady, but certainly having some difficulty sorting fake from more reliable sources, sorting problematic and extremist content from mainstream content. That, in fact, is what's going on here, I would argue. And that, in fact, is what hyperpartisanship is built on. Now, hyperconnectivity in itself is not a bad thing, of course. I also want to make that very clear, because, of course, being connected also provides social support to many groups in society who haven't had that in the same way before the advent of social media 20 years ago. So it's not about connectivity itself, and we wouldn't be better off if we had less connectivity. It's what people do with that and what they associate themselves with, how they connect to others, and what information they incorporate into their worldviews. That, in fact, is what I think is driving hyperpartisanship, and by extension, then also polarization. So again, this is not something actually particularly new. This is David Weinberger saying this in 2004, almost 20 years ago, when he said, and the technology was a bit different at the time, the problem with an extraterrestrial conspiracy mailing list isn't that it's an echo chamber, it's that it thinks there's a conspiracy by extraterrestrials. The problem with QAnon, we could say, is also not that it's an echo chamber, it's that they have some very weird and dangerous beliefs. So that is the problem. These people are not unaware of what everyone else is thinking. They've just rejected it, and they've come to a very different conclusion from the mainstream of society, to a point where they are essentially not in terms of their communication, but in terms of their ideology, disconnecting themselves from the rest of mainstream society. So this is really the problem that we're dealing with here. And that's why certainly my interest is in polarization and hyperpartisanship and what leads to these, rather than in blaming the technologies that we're using for putting us into filter bubbles, echo chambers. In fact, it is what it says here, doing your own research, of course, that's the problem. And I'm putting this up largely because I just like the fact that this is on a show called Reliable Sources, because that's precisely the question. Which sources are reliable? How do you work that out? And then, of course, that also leads us to questions of, well, how do you engage with the sources that you actually see? Again, this is actually going back some time. We've seen for some time now that the people who are most hyperpartisan, who are furthest on the fringes, are actually also very active users, very active visitors of very mainstream content. Back in 2011, in fact, Genska and Shapiro showed that people who visited Stormfront, far-right fascist website, were also highly active users of the New York Times, readers of the New York Times. Not because they like it, but because they hate it and because they need to know what the enemy from their point of view thinks. And they're more likely to visit the New York Times than someone who's reading a middle-of-the-road kind of news site like Yahoo News. And you could substitute many other sources for that as well. So what we're seeing here is that these people, again, they might be on the fringes, they might be hyperpartisans, but they're very thoroughly connected to mainstream thought as well. They're just outright rejecting its premises and substituting their own. So this is, again, very clear evidence that they're not in an echo chamber where they don't see content from other sides anymore, but they are actually very thoroughly connected. They just process this information in a very different kind of way. So again, going back to Midjourney, this is how Midjourney thinks an echo chamber, what an echo chamber looks like. And I think it's a great visualization actually of that, because I think a lot of the people who actually propose these ideas of echo chambers kind of think of it in that way as well. You have just a very limited set of sources that you receive from on high, and you take all of that in without even in any way kind of questioning that. And that's just not the case, frankly. That's just not the observable reality. Observable reality looks a bit more like this, where you have just this abundance of sources, this abundance of information that you stand in front of, somewhat confused, and you have to deal with. So this is what hyperconnectivity looks like, and processing that, dealing with that, is really the much more fundamental problem that people, I think, are facing. So if not echo chambers, filter bubbles, can we then blame fake news, or NAC flares, as it says there? Thank you, Midjourney. That may be a little bit closer to the truth. Of course, that does, in fact, feed into a lot of the views and ideologies of particularly those fringe hyperpartisans. And as colleagues of ours, in fact, Michael Disrani here at the DMRC and Tanya Notley at Western Sydney University have found, not just children, but in fact any age group in Australia have difficulty processing fake news, or rather distinguishing problematic news sources from reliable news sources. So it might also be a question of media literacy. But unfortunately, media literacy is also something of a double-edged sword. We know that there is an intense connection between different sources of information. We know, in fact, that media literacy is also, to some extent, a problem amongst journalists, amongst media workers, where it's not simply that if we could get rid of these problematic sources, everything would be better, because a big part of the problem is also in the mainstream media. So from some work that Eddie Hercombe and Stephen Harrington and Nadia Jude and I have done, we traced the 5G conspiracy theory, and what we found is, well, at first it just sort of circulates in these very obscure blogs and other outlets that are kind of pushing correlations between 5G and COVID-19. We see it moving again, just very much on the fringes of Facebook at this point, without anyone really particularly getting involved. It's such an obscure story that even InfoWars wasn't getting involved in the story at first. And it takes off only once the celebrities, and more to the point, celebrity outlets, celebrity pages, celebrity magazines get involved and report on what celebrities are saying, that it really generates some very significant traction. Whether that's singers or movie stars or boxers, out of favor boxers, as in the case of Amir Khan here. That's when it reaches literally tens of millions of Facebook users finally. And then it also makes its way into tabloid and other outlets. So journalism itself actually has a pretty significant role to play in all of this, and particularly celebrity and entertainment journalism, we found, is very much the soft underbelly, if you like, of the news. This is where people who perhaps aren't really formally trained as journalists, but are simply click workers, are generating quick content that is meant to be sticky and meant to attract audiences, where celebrity posts on whatever topic are just quick and easy fodder, and that's how these sorts of stories make their way from the fringes into much more mainstream circulation. So it's not simply that we can say, well, it's a matter just of fake news sources, of identified problematic outlets, but it makes its way into much more mainstream circulation with the help of these kinds of super spreaders, these amplifiers who are pushing this, and that's the celebrities and the celebrity journalists who are covering their content. So, and then of course we do have outlets that are very much on the fringes and are kind of in a very problematic space, where they again popularize these conspiracy theories and other problematic readings of the news for a much larger audience. Simon Copland, Tim Graham, and I did some work a little while ago, for instance, on the audiences, the Facebook audiences for Sky News video content. And what we found was that, yes, there is a kind of an Australian part to their Facebook audiences that are basically following whatever the Sky News After Dark talking heads are doing, but that stays largely in Australia, and it's kind of small scale. The much bigger scale is on the US side, when some of these stories address more broader international conspiracy theories or directly address US content as well, and themes in US politics, and that's where they start reaching some very large audiences, not as reliably and not as frequently, but when they do, they really go off. So the biggest story during the time that we looked at it was Sky News covering the whole Hunter Biden laptop conspiracy story, for instance, and that just went everywhere in the US. And then whether to meet is in a broad range of spaces that promote conspiracy theories, mis and disinformation, particularly, of course, during the time that we looked on COVID-19 as well. So these kinds of outlets are also deeply involved in the spreading of problematic content and in driving this kind of hyperpartisanship, we argue. And that's really ultimately, again, where the whole media literacy idea kind of falls a bit flat, I think, as well, because what you're seeing there, I'm sorry, we should fold this away so you can see it a little bit more clearly, perhaps if you can, Tariq. What you're seeing on the screen there is, if you remember Britannica, it's what we used to use before Wikipedia. It put out some information here and some advice on fact-checking, basically, on media literacy, saying choose your sources wisely, proceed with caution, trust expertise, expand your search, understand the context. That all sounds fine and sounds very sensible, I guess, as advice for anyone searching for information online. But with a just different coordinate system of what's true and what's false, someone who follows QAnon would subscribe to all of this as well. Choose your sources wisely, i.e. don't trust the New York Times. Proceed with caution. Be skeptical if people tell you about, how good Joe Biden is or whatever. Trust expertise. Well, that means trust Q more than anyone else. Expand your search. That's literally saying do your own research and understand the context. So again, understand if it's coming from the Democrats, you can't believe it. If it's coming from Trump, you should absolutely believe it. So they have media literacy. They have weaponized media literacy in a sense, just as much. Hyperpartisans generally, I'm not just talking about QAnon, have essentially weaponized media literacy for their ends, and they're using exactly the same strategies, just with a very different coordinate system of what's true and what's false from their perspective. So media literacy training itself isn't the solution unless it contains some sort of set of some sort of coordinate system, if you like, of what to trust, what not to trust. And that, of course, becomes a lot more problematic because that ends up being a value judgment as well. So we have a problem in a sense if media literacy is the only answer to these issues as well, because it can easily be turned on its head and misused and go in the exactly opposite direction. So fake news, and this is my summary of this part, is really the symptom, not the cause of hyperpartisanship, of polarization. What we're seeing here, and I'm indebted here to Cornel Sandfors, who's summed this up really very nicely, is essentially a form of fandom, fans and anti-fans in politics, in much the same way that you've got fans and anti-fans in other areas of culture. It's actually not so much about whether information is true or not anymore for people who are in these hyperpartisan fringes, but which news information they choose to believe. So whether they are fans of InfoWars or Tucker Carlson, as the case may be, or fans of the New York Times and the Washington Post, to take some really American examples, obviously, with all of this. That is, I think, the situation that we're finding ourselves in. And of course, that means that fake news will continue to circulate as long as enough people kind of believe in these outlets or feel that they need to be fans of these outlets and share whatever it is that they publish, quite regardless of the truth value. So it's no longer about the truth. It's about fandom, essentially, from that perspective. And of course, yes, not just to believe, but when we come to social media, particularly also to share on, to pass on, to amplify, to make visible to a much larger audience. Okay, so where does all of that get us? The big question then for me is, well, this seems to be the situation that we're in. We've got these hyperpartisans on the fringes. We have their particular fake news sources that they like to share, like to engage with. and obviously the particular actors in politics and other spaces that they end up supporting or attacking. So there seems to be a lot of hyperpartisanship, there seems to be a lot of polarization around. But was it always like this? Has it actually got worse or not? Or has it just become more visible perhaps during the COVID years as well? So how do we actually assess polarization effectively in all of this? And how do we assess it perhaps over time to see whether in fact it is getting worse? How do we perhaps also compare ideally across countries to see where the problems lie, if Australia is as far gone on this, for instance, as the US seems to be, and if perhaps particular political or media systems are more reliable, more resilient against these sorts of things than others are. So how do we make sense of polarization from this perspective? The short answer is it's quite complicated, and the more the more work we've done over the last year or so in developing our project agenda, the more complicated it's turned out to be, simply because there are so many different definitions of polarization out there as well, so many different approaches to polarization already out there that we're trying to make sense of. There is, of course, something as simplistic possibly as this, which is, I'm not criticizing it so much. It's valuable in a sense. It provides one indicator. This is from the US, and it's only going to 2017 in this graph, but it may well have continued further, where we see the sort of median positioning of declared Democrats and Republicans drift further apart on 10 political values questions that the Pew Center asked them about. So that's an indication that there's some kind of trend apart going on, but of course that's maybe only one way in which you could measure and assess polarization. Ask people questions about where they stand on particular issues, gun rights, abortion, the usual sort of flashpoints in the US, and perhaps they'll tell you truthfully what they believe, or maybe perhaps they'll just tell you what they think you want to hear, what they think they should be answering if they define themselves as a Republican or a Democrat. So what exactly does that tell us, and does it help us really get to the core of polarization in more detail? This is necessarily, a kind of a reduction to a fairly simple left versus right, Republican versus Democrat scale here. In looking at this in much more detail, really, we're finding that there are many different ways in which we could assess polarization. Of course, there is, of course, issue-based polarization, and this is perhaps what the previous graph was partly based on, where you ask people about a number of issues, see how they stand, and then aggregate this together into some sort of standing. Issue-based polarization on particular issues, particular policy settings, obviously. There is, beyond that, ideological polarization that's much more based in fundamental ideologies, to the extent that people actually have a coherent, consistent political belief system. There is increasingly also in the literature a focus on affective polarization, of course, and that's really getting to the point where it's no longer just about any kind of rational choice of the best policy on a particular issue, or even of the ideology that you find is most palatable and most sensible for the betterment of society, but actually it's much more about an affective attachment. This is sort of the fandom and anti-fandom, essentially, to a particular political grouping, party or other group, and of course the opposite, then the rejection of the outgroups that are not part of your specific grouping. So this is perhaps much more the sort of sense of the tribes of Liberal and Labour here, or of Democrats and Republicans in the US, or of various other political groupings. But of course, it could also go well beyond organized party politics towards groups like QAnon, sovereign citizens, and whatever else is out there as well, where it's really about us versus them in some form. And that's no longer based purely in any kind of rational decision making, but much more based in your own sense of identity and your own deeply felt sense of personal identity and belonging. That's probably always been there. I'm not saying that's suddenly kind of become a bigger part of people's political identities, but it's been more recognized in literature, in a literature that perhaps traditionally has focused much more on rational decision-making on particular issues and overall ideologies. So these are perhaps the more intrinsic forms of polarization. Beyond that, then also there are a couple of other forms of polarization that have been identified that are much more about how you perceive others and how you perceive society overall. So perceived polarization, and that's really the individual's view of how polarized society overall is, and that could, of course, well be influenced quite significantly by the media reporting on polarization as well. And in fact, then might also influence, of course, the sorts of graphs that I've just shown you previously, because people might then answer give their answers on these particular policy settings based on how they believe a proper Republican or a proper Democrat should actually position themselves, when perhaps their own view isn't quite as firmly set as the graph makes out. So that's the perception of society overall, and that, of course, in turn also influences how you interpret individual issues, individual events, and individual media coverage on specific issues. So that's interpretive polarization, which again takes us back to this question of how different groups in society read the same media stories. So how a core reader of the New York Times might read its articles very differently from someone who is actually just hate reading the New York Times, basically. So these are the sorts of key forms of polarization that certainly have emerged through the work that we've been doing in our team. But of course, there's plenty more as well. And whenever we read articles, there seems to be some other definition of polarization that pops up somewhere along the way as well. So there is a lot of disagreement in the literature just on how we even define polarization, and in turn also, of course, how we might assess and measure levels of polarization on issues or more broadly in society. The next problem with the whole polarization literature then is also how we actually assess how bad it is and whether in fact it's a problem. So as the heading there says, is this simply ordinary politics, ordinary agonistic politics, fights amongst or disagreements between different groups in society? Is it polarization in a more significant form? Is it in fact dysfunction to a point where the political process itself starts to break down? So how would we make sense of this? All politics ultimately is polarized. You wouldn't have multiple political parties in the country without some level of polarization, without different ideas being put forward, and of course interest groups and ultimately parties forming around those ideas. So polarization isn't in itself a problem unless it becomes so dysfunctional, or the polarization gets so deep that society becomes dysfunctional over it. Agreements over the right policy, as long as they can be resolved or some form of consensus can be found, are not in themselves problematic in politics as such. The other problem that we're also seeing is that so much of the polarization literature comes out of the US and assumes, of course, that every country simply has a nice left-right scale between two parties, but maybe most politics globally is multipolar rather than just bipolar. Even, of course, in US politics, if you look more closely, you've got divisions within the individual parties, from, well, what used to be the Tea Party is now perhaps the Freedom Caucus, to more establishment Republicans, to establishment Democrats, to the Bernie-crats. So there are more groupings than perhaps a simple left-right, the Democrat versus Republican scale would make out to be. That's again why I like this crazy Midjourney graph there, because it already implies that there are multiple positions that maybe overlap to a certain extent or maybe don't. So how do we get away from this view of politics as left versus right and come to a much more multipolar, much more complex, multidimensional perspective, perhaps, of patterns of polarization in society and in politics? But ultimately, as I said, the main question is really, when does this sort of mild antagonism, this mild sense of we have different views on a particular issue, let's try and work together to resolve them or to find consensus, when does that turn into more destructive forms of polarization, where that kind of consensus finding is no longer possible and perhaps is actively seen as a sign of weakness that needs to be avoided? So how does that happen? And in work that we've done, we'll present at RCA this year, that Katrine Esau has led in our team, we suggest that there's really 5 key indicators for this. Breakdown of communication between the different sides, perhaps quite obviously, to the point where the different sides are discrediting and dismissing each other's inputs and information. In doing so, erasing complexities in these issues. So you're either for guns or against guns. You're either for abortion or against abortion. Again, to use some very US examples, in the process also an increasing push towards the extremes of the debate. So more and more attention and space for extreme voices in all of this. And of course, all of this also very much underpinned by much more emotive, affective language rather than a focus on, rational and calm policy debate. So these, we suggest, are 5 indicators. There may be more, and perhaps others can suggest more ideas here as well. But we see these, I think, as clear indicators that polarization is turning dysfunctional, moving beyond simple political disagreement that may still be able to be resolved to a point where resolution is no longer possible and perhaps no longer wanted even by the different parties to this antagonism. All right, so the way, and this is start to wrap up, the way that we're approaching this in this project, and I'd love to see feedback and input on this as well, if you have any, is to look then for signs of polarization in across a number of different dimensions. Our first dimension actually is kind of prompted by this, which is really about the media landscape, the news media landscape, and how we might position particular outlets. Some of you might have seen this before. This is from the US, and it kind of feels intuitively perhaps kind of sensible, just positioning the different outlets from the fringes to the center on this sort of graph, saying, well, they're more left, they're more right, they're more factual, they're more tendentious and prone to exaggeration. So it kind of intuitively, it doesn't seem particularly wrong, but when you look closer, what is this actually based on is kind of the big question. And if you look even closer, you see this is simply done by some company or organization called Media Bias Chart, who I think, as far as I can understand it, are basically just a few PR dudes who kind of just reckon that, yeah, we'll put them there and them there, and they're a bit more left than those. But there isn't really any empirical research that's gone into this. But it would be really interesting if we could come to something like this in an empirical and rigorous way, of course. So one of the items on our agenda is to try and do this, essentially, to try and identify differences in media coverage, let's say, across the Australian media landscape. And on that basis, again, not necessarily position them on a left-right kind of scale simply, but try and work out where the gaps and the divisions are amongst Australian news outlets in how they cover particular news stories, how they cover the news overall, what sources get to speak, what actors are present, what language is being used, how much time and space is devoted to particular issues, and so on. So could we do this, but could we do it scientifically rather than just by our reckons? That, to me, is one of the really interesting kind of challenges. We do, of course, also have this sort of stuff from the Digital News Report, the Australian version here, that the News Media Research Centre in Canberra are running, who find that this is how audiences, I guess, perceive their outlets. And again, this seems intuitively not wrong. Sky News, they're sort of on the far right, frankly. I'm not sure that The Age is necessarily the most left-wing outlet in Australia. That seems unlikely, but There you go. This is, I should also say, offline news brands. When we look at online news brands, everything shifts, but so does Sky News. So online readers of Sky News find it to be basically middle of the road. Again, that seems weird, and I'm not doubting that's what the survey is getting, but again, it just seems somewhat odd. So how do we reconcile these things for online versus offline? Is it simply different audiences with different coordinate systems to begin with? What's going on there? And are there other ways to, again, look at the audiencing basically for news, and on that basis also position these news outlets perhaps as well as the audience members themselves, again, maybe beyond just a purely left-right scale. So that's one of the areas that we're interested in as well. And then, of course, there's news engagement, not just news audiencing. So that's sharing also of news via social media, for instance. This is from work in the US, where they looked at the people who retweeted Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump in the 2016 election, and then looked at what news content they were sharing. And surprise not, of course, that people who retweeted Trump were sharing a lot more what they identified as right-wing news outlets. People who retweeted Clinton shared a lot more left-wing news outlets. That's perhaps to be expected, but underlying this is again also the question, well, how do you work out whether news outlets are left or right in the first place? So there's this sort of it bites itself in the tail at some point here as well, and there's more work that needs to be done. But that's also an area that we're very much interested in. And of course, more broadly, there's the question of public discourse, which in many cases means social media discourse. Certainly for us, that's one of the areas that we're most interested in. Can we see evidence of polarization, and how bad is that evidence? How significant is that evidence here? And I'm going to give a shout out here to Ehsan Dehan again and his work, who showed back in the day when we had a debate about the 18C discrimination paragraph, that there was a fairly clear kind of division between the people who we identified as being on the hard right in Australian politics and others about whether 18C should be reformed, whether, as George Brandis at that point said, people should have the right to be bigots. And no points for guessing who was on which side of that debate, obviously. But when Ehsan looked at the debate around Robodebt, there wasn't any polarization because, frankly, everyone hated it. Whether you're left or right, you probably have been affected or knew someone who was affected by Robodebt. So everyone was united in opposing it. And if anything, there was a polarization between the people and the government, which is a kind of a vertical versus horizontal polarization, perhaps. So this also tells us that, of course, these divisions, this partisanship, this perhaps polarization is also highly issue dependent. In fact, that perhaps it's only once multiple issues overlap and we see the same sort of divisions over and over again, we move from partisanship on particular issues to more fundamental polarization between different groups in society. So this is also, of course, one of the areas that we're particularly interested in. So how do we approach this? And this is sort of, well, I'll wrap up. At this point, to share with you some of the kind of key things that we're working on so far, and there's more to come inevitably. We're interested in polarization, as I say, from a number of different angles. Polarization in the news. So what actors, what rhetoric, what sourcing is being used on major issues across the news media? Do we see some clear and distinct differences there between different outlets or perhaps groups of outlets that belong to the same news media operators? Polarization around the news, and this is really more around sharing and engaging with the news, of course. So whatever the news content, do people engage with and engage in sharing of that content in different ways, perhaps based on the outlet or based on the style of coverage from the outlet? Polarization in formal political processes, that's something that we're also very closely looking at, particularly around election campaigns. So what is the rhetoric that's coming from the official actors in those campaigns? What rhetoric are they using? How effective is the rhetoric? Is the content that they share? How do they interact, and all of that as well? So what does that tell us about campaigning styles and the perhaps appeal to partisans and driving of polarization in those sorts of contexts. And then really polarization of debate on major issues and events. And that's, as I say, coming back to particularly social media discussions, where these days that's perhaps the easiest to see these sorts of patterns. Of course, easiest is a relative term given all the changes to access to social media data in recent months, but we'll soldier on with this. So who are the actors on social media, both organized and institutional actors, as well as emergent and self-declared actors? What rhetoric are they using? What are their sourcing practices? How are they interacting with each other? And this initially will be on kind of key flashpoint topics like climate change, like the voice to parliament in Australia, of course, and others where we expect to see patterns of polarization, of course. But then these, again, are spaces where we expect to see polarization. Finally, then the question is also, well, what about aspects of partisanship and polarization that might exist in spaces that aren't normally political? So one of the ideas that we're quite influenced by is the idea of third spaces, which evolved from the idea of third places in the offline world. So in per se apolitical social media spaces, how is politics being discussed there? How are political issues addressed there? And how do those normally apolitical groups, communities, deal with the intrusion of politics into those sorts of topics? So one of the things that we're looking at here, for instance, is debate in footballing spaces about the Qatar World Cup, because clearly people had to come to terms with the World Cup being held in a fundamentally problematic country where human rights are trampled. So how are they actually dealing with that? Are they allowing that kind of debate to happen, or are people simply saying, well, this is not the space for it. Let's just talk about football and ignore everything else. These are some of the questions that we're interested in as well. All right, I might leave it there. Hopefully we've got a bit of time for questions as well. And I know too what John is going to address next week. I hope this is also kind of a good lead into some of the debates and some of the ideas that he'll bring, and then into our discussion in 2 weeks' time as well. So let me perhaps stop sharing the screen. I'll just acknowledge, obviously, our various funders for all of this as well. And hopefully we've got a bit of time for debate still.